think you just hit the talk button.
Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to the subcommittee. Welcome to, who is that to your left there, Mr. Thompson? Yeah, that's the Subcommittee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife will now come to order. Subcommittee's meeting today to hear testimony on a number of wildlife-related bills. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements are limited to the chairman, the ranking member, the vice chair, and the vice ranking member. This allows us to hear from our witnesses sooner and helps members keep their schedules. Therefore, I asked unanimous consent that all members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they're submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today or the close of the hearing, whichever comes first. Hearing no objection, it is so ordered. So, folks, I'm looking forward to discussing the lineup of bills we have before the subcommittee today. These are bills that focus on solutions for wildlife conservation and ensure that we protect biodiversity, which is so critical for healthy ecosystems and communities. It's not an exaggeration to say that the loss of biodiversity right now is an urgent crisis. This subcommittee's already heard from wildlife experts from around the world. And we heard it directly from the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Biodiversity is being destroyed by human activities at a rate unprecedented in history. 1 million species are threatened with extinction. This urgency is real, so we must act now to protect and conserve biodiversity before it's too late. Conserving biodiversity isn't just for the sake of saving animals. Our lives are built around the irreplaceable benefits that we get from wildlife, plants, and ecosystems, like food, clean water, recreation, medicine, cultural practices, and economic revenue. Without biodiversity, we would not be able to maintain the lives we have now. Across the globe, there are a few places where humans have not impacted wildlife. Many species face countless human-related threats, including habitat loss, industrial and commercial activities, pollution, disease, invasive species, and of course, climate change. This subcommittee's been working hard to move legislation that recognizes the value of our wildlife and presents solutions that restore wildlife around the country. Unfortunately, as we do that, the Trump administration has been busy undermining nearly every single environmental protection we have. In addition to opening up some of our most special places like the Arctic Wildlife Refuge to oil and gas extraction, the administration is rolling back protections for migratory birds under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, attempting to build a wall through critical wildlife habitat at the border, and most recently, they've put out new rules that severely undermine the Endangered Species Act. We're seeing over and over again that this administration is prioritizing reckless industry interests over the interests of the American people and our environmental laws. The ESA is the most important law we have to protect imperiled wildlife, but the changes proposed by this administration would undermine the spirit and intention of the ESA and put more species at risk. At a time when scientists tell us we need to do more to address the anthropogenic causes of extinction, it's inconceivable that the Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA, the very agencies charged with protecting wildlife, could be making such devastating decisions. So I look forward to asking our administration witness more about these new ESA regulations as we discuss the other bills before us. We'll also use this legislative hearing to advance forward-thinking bills to address the extinction crisis. Addressing this crisis involves a multi-pronged approach. There isn't going to be a one-size-fits-all solution to protect wildlife and their habitats, and the bills that we have here today represent a wide range of practical, on-the-ground solutions that can help. Several of the bills provide much-needed funding to some of the most endangered and threatened species groups, including my bill, the Critically Endangered Animal Conservation Act, Mr. Jeffrey's bill, the Salamander Act, Chairman Grijalva's bill, the Extinction Prevention Act. Other bills aim to directly eliminate threats facing our wildlife, and this includes Ms. Velasquez's bill to prohibit the use of a dangerous pesticide in national wildlife refuges, and Mr. Harder's bill to expand a program to control that guy right there, the invasive nutria. Mr. Thompson's bill on the North American Wetland Conservation Act, Mr. Whitman's bill on fish habitat conservation, and Mr. Calvert's bill to establish a new wildlife refuge all promote healthy wildlife populations through habitat protections and restoration projects. And then last, but certainly not least, Mr. Cartwright's bill, Safeguarding America's Future and Environment Act, offers a mechanism to start responding to the ongoing and expected effects of climate change to our wildlife and their habitats. I believe it's critical that we maintain the integrity of existing laws and regulations intended to protect wildlife, as well as pass new legislation that addresses emerging threats to wildlife and ensures adequate funding for our imperiled species. So with that, I will yield and invite Ranking Member McClintock to say a few words.
Before I start, just for the record, when the chairman said that talked to the need to exterminate this pest and pointed, he was pointing at the stuffed animal,
Yeah,
and not at Congressman Thompson. Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The subcommittee meets today to consider 10 bills, almost all of which seek to expand policies that just aren't working. For many years, my Republican colleagues have noted the stunning lack of progress in recovering endangered species despite crushing costs imposed on American producers and consumers and billions of dollars of direct expropriations from American taxpayers. We have spent the last 50 years now gobbling up more and more land and imposing more and more draconian regulations with draconian penalties, all in the name of improving the natural environment and preserving species. Yet we're confronted today with morbidly overgrown forests and scant progress on species preservation. I beg the majority to consider the testimony they're about to hear from Brian Seasholes of the Southwest Communities Coalition, who offers us the most sensible advice we could have on rethinking our entire approach to environmental protection. The central issue he explores is how incentives matter, and that our approach of heavy and ham-handed regulation actually spawns perverse incentives that work against what should be our shared environmental objectives. This point came to my attention years ago growing up in a city called Thousand Oaks. Well, some city council member decided that we should protect the town's namesake by making it illegal to cut down any oak tree in Thousand Oaks. The ordinance was passed with an abundance of self-proclaimed virtue. Unfortunately, nobody bothered to ask, well, who in his right mind is going to plant an oak tree on his property if thereafter he can never cut it down? Who is not going to quietly kill a seedling on his property for fear that it might enter the official registry of oak trees and become an eternal lien on that land? These very laws have spawned the maxim, shoot, shovel, and shut up of any potentially protected species found on private property. And by taking more and more land into public ownership, we run afoul of what economists call the tragedy of the commons. If nobody owns a habitat, nobody has an incentive to properly manage it, and everybody has an incentive to exploit it. This is what the wildlife conservation experts representing the African nations were trying unsuccessfully to get us to understand on a recent bill that seeks to collapse trophy hunting on the African continent. As the conservationists explained, it is precisely the carefully regulated trophy hunting industry and the value it generates that produces the incentives and the resources for habitat management and species preservation. The very presence of this industry provides disincentives for poaching and incentives to protect these habitats against poaching. I've remarked before that the slaughter rate of cows in this country is, well, I hesitate to say it is utterly appalling, but it certainly is shocking. We slaughter 39 million cows and calves in this country. I finally got that, huh? We slaughter 39 million cows and calves in this country every year. They should be on the endangered species list because at that rate, cows should be extinct in this country within just a few years. And yet we never seem to run out of them. That's because they have value. And that very value is what provides the incentive to breed them and care for them. Until, of course, the new Green Deal outlaws them, then they will become an endangered species because an underground market will have every incentive to exploit them, while nobody will have an incentive to protect them. We should listen to Mr. Seychelles. Incentives matter, and our laws will be spectacularly unsuccessful whenever they fail to act in harmony with human nature. Every species has value. It may be for food, for products, for hunting, for hobbies, for entertainment, for research, but only when there is an ownership stake are there going to be practical incentives to preserve and protect them. We have bred these positive incentives out of our laws and replaced them with perverse incentives produced by laws incompatible with our own nature, and then we wonder why they're not working while we double and triple down on them like many of the bills before us today. We need to change our approach. We need to replace shoot, shovel, and shut up with proliferate, protect, and profit. That's the difference between condors and cattle. That's the reason why privately owned forests are well-groomed and well-maintained, while our public forests are morbidly overcrowded, diseased, dying, and burning. Ironically, perhaps deliberately, this hearing was called at the same time that the bipartisan Western Caucus is holding its ESA roundtable here at the Capitol, bringing together conservationists, property owners, and other stakeholders to explore these very issues. And since we can't be in both places, I'm very glad to have Mr. Seychelles here today to educate us in this room. With that, I yield back.
All right, thank you, Mr. McClintock. We will now start things off by hearing from the lead sponsors of today's bills, asking them to make their remarks. We'll start with members who are not members of the committee. And let me remind our witnesses that under our committee rules, they should limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, and their entire written statement will, of course, appear in the hearing record. I think you gentlemen know that when you begin, the lights on the witness table will be green, and at 4 minutes, they'll be yellow. The red light comes at the 5-minute point at which we will ask you to wrap up your statement. So first we'll hear from Congressman Mike Thompson of California. He is the lead sponsor of H.R. 925, the North American Wetlands Conservation Extension Act, or NACA. Representative Thompson, you have 5 minutes to tell us about your bill. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Along with Mr. Whitman, we both have the privilege of evaluating and improving NACA-funded projects in the United States, Canada, and Mexico. As chairman of the Congressional Land Conservation Caucus and a lifelong hunter and outdoorsman, I feel a strong sense of responsibility to ensure that everyone in America can use and enjoy the natural resources that belong to all of us. Since 1989, North American Wetlands Conservation Act grants have funded close to 3,000 projects carried out by more than 6,000 partners. These federal grants require a 1-to-1 non-federal match, and over the past 30 years, $1.6 billion in federal funding has been matched more than 3-to-1, with $4.7 billion contributed by non-federal partners. The result so far has been 29.8 million acres, an area the size of Pennsylvania, of rehabilitated and restored wetlands. These wetlands support ecological health and biodiversity while providing outstanding opportunities for Americans to birdwatch, hunt, fish, hike, farm, and ranch. H.R. 925 reauthorizes NACA so we can continue this critical work on North America's wetland. It's an honor that my NACA bill is being heard alongside so many other important pieces of bipartisan legislation that together will ensure that we continue to protect birds and other wildlife by conserving the public lands that allow them to thrive on behalf of all Americans now and for future generations. Thank you for your time and consideration, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Congressman Thompson. We will next hear from Representative Josh Harder of California, who has brought a charismatic guest with him at the dais.
Thank you, Chairman Huffman, and thank you, Ranking Member McClintock. I appreciate the opportunity to come testify and talk about the risk that nutria, like my friend Nellie here, pose to my home in the California Central Valley, and the legislation that we wrote that would stop it. As you can see, this is right here a life-size nutria, commonly referred to as a swamp rat, that we've named Nellie to illustrate the size of the nutria and to show you what we're really up against here. Nutria can grow up to 40 pounds. Nellie here is more of a mid-sized nutria. She probably weighed somewhere around 20 pounds, so they get twice as big as this one right here. It's tough to see, but she also has what the LA Times called nacho cheese teeth that are used to eat plants that are native to wetlands and swamps. And Nellie and her friends really need these teeth because they eat a lot. In fact, nutria like this eat a quarter of their weight in food every single day. That's a lot of food. That's 10 pounds a day of wetlands and water infrastructure, canals, and the like. They're very friendly with each other. One female can lead to 200 offspring every single year. And the California Department of Fish and Wildlife has warned that if we don't take action immediately, there will be 250,000 nutria in California within 5 years. 250,000. Nellie's family in Louisiana have caused an immense amount of damage over the past 100 years. I'm sure my colleague, Mr. Graves, can attest to the real havoc these swamp rats cause, and now they're in California. We have to stop the swamp rat invasion before it gets out of control, because this is an exponential growth curve that we're dealing with here. Nutria can destroy crops, they destroy almond trees, as well as irrigation canals. They can even cause flooding because they burrow into the water control systems that threaten our water infrastructure. They're a threat to our native wildlife and our local ecosystems. I've heard the real concerns of inaction from both farmers and environmentalists. This issue unites them in a way very few issues in front of this committee do. To me, that shows that this is a common sense issue we need to get behind. And that's why this investment is so important. My bill would simply revive a program that has proven success, that the state of Maryland used to almost entirely eliminate the infestation in the Chesapeake Bay. This program uses a variety of strategies to control and eradicate the invaders, and it ended up saving a ton of money in the long run in Maryland. My bill would bring back that program and make California eligible and funded at a rate of $7 million. This is a tiny investment compared to what will be needed if we do not nip this problem in the bud. Between the time I introduced this bill in June and today, the CDFW has removed over 150 nutria from the wild. Time is of the essence, and I encourage widespread support of this bill. I want to thank the co-sponsors as well, Representative Garamendi, Costa, Cox, and Lee for joining me in this fight, as nutria are not constrained to a single district. This is a California-wide issue. And I want to thank the committee for giving me an opportunity to come and discuss this bill. I look forward to working with you and help get it across the finish line. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
Thank you, Representative Harder. We will now hear from Representative Matt Cartwright of Pennsylvania to speak on his bill, H.R. 2748, the Safeguarding America's Future and Environment Act. Representative Cartwright, you have 5 minutes. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for giving me the opportunity to testify here today and for consideration of this critical bill. I would like to thank Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, who has been instrumental in drafting and advancing this legislation. I'd also like to thank the great champions in the environmental community, particularly the defenders of wildlife, for lending their expertise in this effort, and a special thank you to Amy Delac for testifying today at this hearing and for her support. Extreme weather events have become progressively more frequent and destructive in the past decades. This escalation in frequency and intensity puts our ecological and economic stability at risk. Last year alone, extreme weather cost our economy $91 billion. Over the past decade, it has cost our economy $761 billion. Polar sea ice has declined by an average annual rate of 13,500 square miles since 1979. That's an annual rate. The equivalent of losing an area of sea ice larger than the state of Maryland every year. This loss causes oceans to heat faster, which in turn results in weather and climate disruptions around the world. Moreover, higher sea levels mean that storm surges push further inland. So not only are storms more severe, but they also have a wider area of effect. According to the Bureau of Economic Analysis, in 2016, outdoor recreation accounted for 2.2% of the American GDP. Moreover, a survey from 2017 estimated that the industry provided 7.6 million jobs around the nation. A healthy ecosystem not only impacts outdoor recreation, hunting, and fishing, but also life-sustaining infrastructure like the availability of medicines, drinking water systems, our agricultural industry, and our ecosystem's ability to store carbon. It's imperative that we prepare for the effects of climate change and extreme weather, and that we also focus specifically on climate change's impact on our natural resources. And for this reason, I introduced H.R. 2748, the SAFE Act. The SAFE Act fortifies our national and local climate resiliency. It ensures that federal agencies and states have plans in place to mitigate the effects of climate change on our nation's important natural resources. It also enhances our government's scientific capabilities to study strategies to attenuate the effects of climate change. The SAFE Act establishes a national fish, wildlife, and plants climate adaptation strategy joint implementation working group. This will serve as a forum for interagency coordination and consultation on the development of the national fish, wildlife, and plants climate change adaptation policy. The bill directs the working group to adopt and revise the national strategy, as well as publish a biannual report for the public on implementation of the national strategy. It also establishes a National Climate Change and Wildlife Science Center that is tasked with developing scientific knowledge, tools, and strategies to address the effects of climate change on the environment. Additionally, it establishes an advisory committee on climate change and natural resource sciences, which would advise the working group on the current science of climate change and strategies for climate change adaptation. And lastly, the SAFE Act requires states to develop a state adaptation plan detailing the state's efforts to address climate change. The idea is that you're forcing government affirmatively, proactively to plan for the future so that we save economic resources, natural resources, and the portfolio of assets that the government has. It's only responsible planning for what we see coming down the pike. I believe that the SAFE Act would play a critical role in helping us plan for the impacts of climate change. And for that reason, I hope and urge this committee favorably to consider this legislation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back. I'm sorry I don't have a show and tell item for you this afternoon.
You could have brought some sea ice, perhaps. But thank you, Representative Cartwright. Next, we'll hear from Subcommittee Member Representative Rob Whitman of Virginia. He's the lead sponsor of H.R. 1747, the National Fish Habitat Conservation Through Partnerships Act. Representative Whitman, the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you and the ranking member and fellow members of this subcommittee for the great work that you do continuously. And I want to start by thanking both you and the ranking member for allowing this bill, H.R. 1747, to receive a legislative hearing today. I also want to thank the witnesses for being here to discuss these important pieces of legislation. Finally, I want to thank Congressman Invasive for being an original co-sponsor on H.R. 1747 and for his support. H.R. 1747, the National Fish Habitat Conservation Through Partnerships Act, was modeled after two of the most successful conservation endeavors in our nation's history, the state and locally led collaborative joint ventures model for implementing voluntary conservation actions on the ground to conserve birds and their habitats, and the North American Wetlands Conservation Act, better known as NAWCA, which for 30 years has proven to be one of the most successful conservation programs in the U.S., by utilizing a state-led collaborative process. This legislation codifies the National Fish Habitat Partnerships, an initiative that aims to achieve measurable habitat conservation results through strategic partnerships that lead to better fish habitat conditions and increase fishing opportunities. This program has been and will continue to be driven by local and regionally based fish habitat partnerships. The partnerships are comprised of representatives of federal, state, and local agencies, conservation and sportsmen's organizations, private landowners, and the business sector. These partnerships have already led to over 840 successful conservation projects in 50 states, benefiting fish habitat and anglers throughout the country. H.R. 1747 allows Congress to further refine how the National Fish Habitat Partnership Program operates. For example, this legislation adds more diverse representation onto the current National Fish Habitat Partnership Board, broadening the input of stakeholders. The board, which recommends local projects implemented through the Fish Habitat Partnerships Program, is done to the Secretary of Interior, who gives the funding approval. This will be now led permanently by state and fish wildlife agencies with clarified federal agency representation and more diverse non-governmental organization representation, including organizations from the agriculture and private industry sectors. Congressional authorization through this legislation would codify the roles of involved parties and help secure an avenue for consistent funding for the on-the-ground fish and aquatic habitat conservation in the states. Currently, under the existing National Fish Habitat Program, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service determines project selection and funding awards, regardless of what the board may recommend. This legislation provides an added layer of transparency and public involvement in project selection. Of the funding authorized in this legislation, only 5% can go to administrative purposes, meaning that more money will go to work to conserve fish habitat. Our nation's 49 million recreational anglers generate over $48 billion in retail sales and $115 billion impact on our economy. This industry also supports 800,000 jobs, which depend on healthy fisheries resources. Healthy waterways and fish populations are absolutely critical to providing clean water and sustainable fisheries. This legislation will protect and restore aquatic communities throughout the nation through public-private partnerships to promote conservation. This legislation has the support of the Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation, as well as the American Sport Fishing Association, the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, and the Backcountry Hunters and Anglers. This legislation takes the current program and makes it better and more effective and increases involvement. By increasing transparency, putting power back in the hands of stakeholders, and requiring accountability to Congress, H.R. 1747 will make sure taxpayers' dollars go further to conserve fish habitat. I want to thank you for consideration of H.R. 1747, and I urge the subcommittee's support of this legislation.
Thank you, Mr. Whitman.
Thank you.
Appreciate that. And next, I would like to ask the chair of the Natural Resources Committee, Raul Grijalva of Arizona, to speak about the two bills that we're considering today, H.R. 2918, the Extinction Prevention Act, and H.R. 4348, the Paw and Fin Conservation Act. Chairman Grijalva, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Chairman Huffman, for holding the hearing and including all these what I believe to be significant pieces of legislation. Mr. Chairman, we're in the midst of an ongoing extinction crisis, and the Trump administration seems to be doing everything in its power to make sure that crisis continues. We need to protect wildlife, And then that need is not just about protecting cute animals. Biodiversity is directly linked to economic health, cultural values, food security, national security, and overall human well-being. Our lives, and for that matter, our livelihoods depend on a thriving biodiversity, and we are losing species faster than we even realize. The Endangered Species Act is the strongest tool we have to prevent species from going extinct. It ensures that species that get listed, no matter what size or shape, get protections. The regulatory changes to ESA by the Trump administration undermine the very purpose of ESA. They are short-sighted and would put more plants and wildlife on the brink of extinction. First, the rules eliminate what we call blanket 4D, the blanket 4D rule at the Fish and Wildlife Service, a rule intended to make sure a species listed as threatened is guaranteed protections to help them recover unless the agency develops a rule based on science to allow for some exceptions. Now, the default will be, now with these changes, the default will be no guaranteed protections for threatened species. Second, the rules change the definition of foreseeable future, preventing Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA from considering the impacts of climate change on wildlife. We know climate change is real, and we are observing impacts of climate change to wildlife every day. It doesn't make any sense for Fish and Wildlife Service to ignore climate change while trying to recover species. The third concern I would like to bring up, but certainly not the last, is regarding the new allowance for Fish and Wildlife and NOAA to consider economic factors alongside species listing decisions. The Endangered Species Act was very clear in this. The statute says that listing decisions shall be made solely on the best scientific information. Does the best available science say a species is threatened or endangered? If so, list it. That's how the ESA works. Listing decisions should be based on science, not industry interest or economic scare tactics. My bill, H.R. 4348, ensures that the Trump administration's new rules will have no force or effect, retaining the integrity and the purpose of ESA. My other bill we are discussing today, the Extinction Prevention Act, simply recognizes several less charismatic and severely underfunded species groups, including Pacific Island plants, Southwest desert fish, eastern mussels, and North American butterflies. Every species deserves protection and resources. My bill simply makes more funding available for these underdog species. I want to thank you, Mr. Huffman, and thank our witnesses who are here today, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will now recognize myself to speak on H.R. 4341, the Critically Endangered Animals Conservation Act. And I'd like to begin by thanking Representative Vern Buchanan for joining me on this bill and helping lead this effort, along with my colleagues on the committee and other bipartisan members who've co-sponsored the bill. While we don't often hear a positive narrative in this committee, wildlife conservation should be a bipartisan issue because it's important for healthy ecosystems and communities around the United States, but also around the world. As I said in my opening statement, we must act now to address an extinction crisis. We must act for everyone who depends on ecosystem services and for future generations who deserve to experience a world as rich in biodiversity as we have today. And this bill would help with that. It would establish the Critically Endangered Animals Conservation Fund to be administered by the Fish and Wildlife Service as part of the successful multinational species conservation funds. The existing conservation funds are critical for wildlife conservation around the world, including programs for elephants, great apes, and marine turtles. This new fund established by my bill would complement existing fish and wildlife international conservation efforts by focusing on the animals species that are most at risk on the International Union for the Conservation of Nature's Red List, as they call it, the most comprehensive global assessment on the conservation status of species. This is a critical need because not all species face the same risk. Those with small populations or narrow distributions face a greater risk of extinction. The Critically Endangered Animals Conservation Fund would focus on species that are especially at risk like snow leopards, Andean cats, African penguins, white-backed vultures, and bally starlings. These are species that are all facing potentially imminent extinction. The bill would establish a new fund and provide competitive grants for the conservation and protection of wildlife outside of the U.S. Eligible projects would focus on habitat, research and monitoring, conservation management, and also training, outreach, and capacity building efforts that help to conserve and restore these populations. The bill authorizes $5 million a year through fiscal year 25, which matches authorization levels for the other multinational species conservation funds. Now, from 2009 through 2014, the Fish and Wildlife Service managed the Critically Endangered Animals Conservation Fund, and it funded more than 100 projects addressing many of the key problems causing the decline of about 70 species around the world. Grants were leveraged with almost double their amounts in matching funds. This fund was among the more popular and competitive of all international grant programs and a vital addition to the existing multinational species conservation funds, addressing threats from illegal wildlife trade, improving wildlife health, mitigating human-wildlife conflict, and adapting to climate change, as well as removing invasive species. While funding for the program lapsed in 2015, it is still a critical piece of the Fish and Wildlife Service's international conservation portfolio, as noted in this support letter that we've submitted in the record from 20 major international conservation organizations. They write, and I'll quote their letter, "Whereas the Multinational Species Conservation Fund supports iconic species, the Critically Endangered Animals Conservation Fund covered imperiled species that desperately need active help to prevent further loss in the wild," end quote. I'd like to, again, enter that letter into the record, and hearing no objection, it is so ordered. The U.S. plays an important role in wildlife conservation around the world, and this bill would help continue this leadership role and build capacity in communities around the world that can also assist in meeting that goal. So thank you very much to my colleagues. I look forward to hearing from the witnesses today.
Mr. Chairman,
yes, sir.
Congressman Calvert could not be here today, but asked that his statement in support of his H.R. 2956 be entered in the record, and I'd ask unanimous consent to do so.
Without objection. We will now hear from our administration witness, Mr. Steve Guertin, who we will ask to come forward and take a seat at the table. Mr. Guertin, you heard the previous admonition about the 5-minute rule and the lights that you'll likely see during your testimony. We welcome you to the subcommittee, and you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member McClintock, and members of the subcommittee. I'm Steve Gurdon, Deputy Director for the United States Fish and Wildlife Service. We appreciate the opportunity to provide testimony on 10 bills addressing fish and wildlife conservation. The 10 bills on today's agenda affect many aspects of the service's work. My written testimony discusses the Department's views on those bills. I'll briefly summarize those views now. The Department supports H.R. 925, which would reauthorize the North American Wetlands Conservation Act. NACA grants have facilitated the participation of thousands of partners on thousands of projects to conserve bird populations and wetland habitat. The Department supports H.R. 925 and looks forward to continuing to build the success of this valuable program. H.R. 1747, the National Fish Habitat Conservation Through Partnerships Act, would codify the existing National Fish Habitat Partnership Program. The legislation would reduce the service's role in project selection and management and significantly reduce service funds to administer the program. The service welcomes the opportunity to provide information to the subcommittee on the effects of this bill on the National Fish Habitat Partnership Program. H.R. 2748, the Safeguarding America's Future and Environment Act, appears to be duplicative of ongoing efforts related to adaptation strategies for fish, wildlife, and plants. The Department welcomes further discussion about coordinating ongoing efforts and identifying resource needs. H.R. 2956 would establish the Western Riverside County National Wildlife Refuge in Southern California. The Department supports the goals of establishing this new refuge, but is concerned that sufficient funds may not be available to operate it given other responsibilities. We appreciate the discretionary process afforded to the Secretary in selecting land for the refuge and we would welcome the opportunity to provide technical assistance to the subcommittee to address this concern. H.R. 2918, the Extinction Prevention Act, would establish 4 new competitive financial assistance programs for North American butterflies, Pacific Island plants, freshwater mussels, and Southwest desert fish. On the international side, H.R. 4340, the Salamander Act, and H.R. 4341, the Critically Endangered Animals Act, would establish competitive grant programs under the Multinational Species Conservation Fund. The Department supports the intent of these bills. However, we would welcome the opportunity to work with the subcommittee to ensure that these new grant programs continue to allow the service to continue to target species that would benefit the most and do not inadvertently restrict limited resources away from other species the service is working to conserve and recover. H.R. 3399 would amend the Nutria Eradication Control Act of 2003 to include California in the program. Nutria populations have been established on the West Coast with new detections just this year in California. The Department supports the inclusion of California in this program. We would be happy to work with the subcommittee to expand this program into legislation to also include other impacted states. H.R. 2854, the Protect Our Refuges Act, would prohibit the use of neonicotinoids on national wildlife refuges. It is service policy that neonicotinoid use should be decided on a case-by-case basis, and accordingly, the Department opposes H.R. 2854. There may be limited, appropriate, and specialized uses of neonicotinoid pesticides in the Fish and Wildlife Service and the refuge system, and decisions are subject to review on a case-by-case basis in compliance with all applicable laws, including NEPA. The Department opposes H.R. 4348, Protect America's Wildlife and Fish in Need of Conservation Act, that would make void 3 final rules promulgated by the Secretaries of Interior and Commerce to amend certain ESA implementing regulations. The Department promulgated these rules in order to improve implementation of the ESA by increasing transparency and the effectiveness of the law. The Service and NIMS finalized rules this summer to ensure delistings are not held to a higher standard than listings, allow a reasonable approach to critical habitat designations, allow a tailored approach to get the level of protection right for threatened species, and to clarify our regulations for consultations. There have been no comprehensive amendments to the Endangered Species Act since 1988, and no comprehensive revisions to the implementing regulations since 1986. In the years since those changes took place, a lot has happened, including court decisions, vast experience in the agencies, and the Service appreciates the subcommittee's interest in furthering wildlife conservation in the United States and across the globe. We stand ready to work with the subcommittee as you consider these and other fish and wildlife conservation management bills. We'd be happy to answer any questions, and thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you, Mr. Gordon. We're glad you joined us today. I know the committee is going to have a lot of questions for your agency, and I hope you'll be able to provide some answers. I'd like to begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes, and I will begin with the recent changes to the implementation of the Endangered Species Act that the administration has announced. Many of us are greatly concerned by these regulatory rollbacks, and so I want to ask you very specifically about that. I know that the way these rules are finalized, there are resource specialists and scientists that in your agency that generally develop them, but what I'm really specifically interested in asking you about is whether the final rule was edited by political appointees.
Mr. Chairman, by the characterization editing, members of the political leadership team were involved in the final review and approval of it, but this was an interactive process throughout the last year.
Can you name which political appointees were involved in the review and revision of the final rules?
I don't know that personally, sir.
Would you say, and you're certainly in position to know, but would you say that significant changes were made to the rules by political appointees?
No, sir, I would not. This rule was originated about a year ago. It involved career staff from NIMS and the Fish and Wildlife Service. There were a number of meetings, check-ins throughout the process over the last year, preparing the written documentation. At appropriate times, the members of the political leadership team and solicitors advised with feedback or comments to strengthen the purpose of the rule.
At any point, did any career scientist object to changes that were being made in the rules?
To the best of my knowledge, no, sir.
You're not aware of even one career scientist in your agency that voiced concern?
I am personally not, no, sir.
Did you hear about any?
No, sir.
Well, I want to ask about the biological opinions that are currently being developed for the Central Valley Project in California. There's been a great deal of public reporting that has raised some troubling questions about whether the work on these important environmental standards has been improperly influenced by conflicts of interest and improper political influence. And of course, those concerns have been raised about the direction of these biological opinions, especially in light of the fact that the Secretary of Interior, your boss, is a former lawyer and lobbyist for one of the major water districts that stands to benefit from weakening the Endangered Species Act and these biological opinions. So, Mr. Guertin, just so the public can know once and for all whether politics and conflicts of interests are improperly influencing these science-based products from your agency, I have asked the administration multiple times to give us the communications with the Wetlands Water District and other non-federal parties on these BIOPs. And I'm glad that you're here today because I want to ask if you will fully commit to complying with this request, which I've made multiple times so that this committee can properly assess whether the administration is meeting its obligations under the law.
Mr. Chairman, I will personally commit to carry your message back to DOI leadership and stress to them your concern and importance of this request, and I will do what I can to help
that part I'm not worried about. I know they've gotten the request. I don't need a courier here. What I do need is I need cooperation and compliance.
Yes, sir.
I think it's a reasonable question to ask for this information so that we can put to rest this cloud of concern. Will you commit to cooperating with this subcommittee and giving us the information?
Yes, sir, I will.
All right, we appreciate that. Thank you. Mr. Guertin, it's my understanding the effective date of the ESA regulations was supposed to be August 27th, but we just learned the regulation pertaining to Section 7 of the ESA has been postponed to October 28th. Now, the regulations for Section 4 changes, my understanding, will go into effect this week. Why the delay on Section 7 guidance?
Mr. Chairman, just so we had more time to connect with our colleagues in the federal family, the Forest Service, the Bureau of Reclamation, the EPA, the other land management agencies, make sure they fully understood what was in the regulation revisions, train employees of what is coming their way, and give them a little more learning.
All right, did it have anything to do with the Central Valley Project biological opinion? Because my understanding is that is expected in mid-October, and so I'm interested to know how the change to Section 7 would impact that CVP BIOP and whether those changes would need to be incorporated in the CVP BIOP.
The BIOP will be coming online probably before those new regulations come into effect. We understand the department position is we'll get those BIOPs out for public review and comment next month in October. The decision to extend the training for the federal agencies had nothing to do with California water issues, but was more feedback from other partner agencies.
All right, but just to be clear, if the Section 7 final guidance comes after the CVP BIOP, will the CVP BIOP then need to be updated to reflect those changes?
Mr. Chairman, we'd have to really get back to you for the record on that. We'd have to determine the syncing up of those, and I'll follow up on that for you personally.
All right, I appreciate that, sir. Thank you. I'll recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Well, just on that point, I would certainly urge the administration to resist the political pressure from the left over ruinous policies for the people of California. We live in one of the most water-rich regions of the country, and because of these policies, Californians are now facing mandatory water rationing under legislation already signed into law. It would cut residential use to initially to 55 gallons per person per day, about half of what is normal water use. That's what the left can do, turning abundance into scarcity, and I certainly would urge the administration to resist that. We have a bill here that would throw a lot more money into NGOs for protection against poaching, including a letter here in support of Mr. Huffman and Mr. Buchanan's legislation, co-signed by the WWF. Mr. Gordon, I'm sure you're aware of the developments that have come to light regarding U.S.-administered wildlife conservation grants to the WWF and the gruesome acts that transpired using U.S. taxpayer dollars. I have here an article entitled "The U.S. Government Spent Millions Funding WWF-Backed Forces Accused of Torture and Murder." The lead on it reads, "The government is reviewing conservation grants worth $125 million after a BuzzFeed News investigation exposed how WWF-backed guards tortured and killed people." As you're also aware, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has halted millions in international wildlife grants until the investigation is completed into these acts. We're sitting here today considering two bills that would inject new U.S. taxpayer dollars into what is clearly a corruption-laden operation of giving grants to international NGOs with little to no oversight, including the WWF, which is co-submitting letters in support of this legislation. Do you see anything in either H.R. 4340 or H.R. 4341 that would prevent these types of actions from happening again?
Thank you for your question, sir. Yes, I'm aware of the allegations of the use of the World Wildlife Grant funding. We've been cooperating fully within our building, Department of the Interior, for several months to respond to information requests to track down the true story of what happened. We understand the department has reached out to our OIG to have a third-party neutral evaluate the program. We've also been informed that the General Accounting Office, GAO, has approached us with an entrance conference request to begin their audit of these programs as well. The Fish and Wildlife Service, our books are open. We will fully cooperate with all of these investigations. As to your question about the efficacy of these new programs, they seem to be envisioned to push additional resources into other portions of the world, other global areas. We would want to ensure, as we work at a technical basis with the committee staff, as you evaluate the efficacy of these programs, potentially build in some more program management safeguards or other items like that to make sure any future grants are in compliance with human rights and with...
According to this article, the WWF is basically clammed up on this, but there is just, according to the article, indisputable evidence that the money that was provided to them was used for some just horrific acts. An internal report obtained by BuzzFeed News described how rangers at Salongo National Park, which WWF co-manages, had committed extrajudicial murder, tortured men, and I won't go into the details of that, and raped pregnant women. That's where our taxpayer money is going as we funnel this to these NGOs. That's got to stop.
Yes, sir. The department certainly agrees. That's why we're cooperating fully with the OIG. We will cooperate fully with the General Accounting Office. We know our leadership team has reached out to leaders on the Hill here to provide status reports, and all grants at this point are being evaluated even deeper to see what is truly going on the ground with any program obligations.
Great, thank you very much, and I'd like to enter into the record the article published today entitled "The U.S. Government Spent Millions Funding WWF-Backed Forces Accused of Torture and Murder."
No argument there. Thanks. So ordered. The chair now recognizes Mr. Case of Hawaii for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Gorton. The ranking member started off his introductory remarks with a very broad statement, and his statement was that these bills expand policies that just aren't working. Do you subscribe to that view that the Endangered Species Act and related legislation put in place over the last several decades is not working to protect endangered and threatened species in our country?
Congressman, before coming back to D.C., I served as regional director for a mountain prairie region, the Northern Rockies and the prairies, and we tried to make the ESA work in the real world. I think the act has seen its challenges along the way. I think that all of us working together can implement a strong work that will support the American economy and protect species, and I think that the targeted regulatory revisions that have been put on the table this summer through our regulatory revisions give us some strategic tools to help improve performance of the act and make it better for all America.
Okay, but I'm getting to the underlying statement that was made, that our policies are not working. We can debate the specifics of the regulations, and I don't agree with you and your department on the regulatory changes. Nonetheless, those are secondary, tertiary level discussions. I'm asking you whether you are a believer in the basic federal regime to protect our Endangered and Species Act, endangered and threatened species.
Yes, sir. I fully support implementation of the Endangered Species Act. I devoted my professional career to enforcing our wildlife management laws. My point was, I've also seen how hard it is to implement these laws in the real world, and that all of us working together can be much more effective.
Okay, so we can start with the premise that we should have some overall federal protection, and then we can talk about exactly how to do it. But you're not ready to throw the whole thing out.
No, sir. Neither is the Department of the Interior.
Okay. Turning to Hawaii specifically, we are, of course, as we will hear shortly from Mr. Smith from my state, who you have worked with, we are sometimes referred to the endangered species capital of the world. We have, of the 1,275 listed endangered species of animals and plants, 503, we're talking about nationally, 503 are from Hawaii, are in Hawaii. We also have another 14 that are threatened. So clearly we have about 40% of the total endangered species and threatened species of plants and animals in our country, 40% in one state. We get about 5% of the funding to protect. Why? Why is that?
So, Congressman, your question is why, when the Fish and Wildlife Service makes program allocations, is the state of Hawaii only receiving a set percentage of it? And we have a variety of programs that we implement, whether it's the Endangered Species Recovery Program, management of the refuges. We try to set priorities against national level objectives. We try to do the best we can to fulfill all the needs out there. Hawaii has remained a priority for the Fish and Wildlife, particularly our approach to look at more of a ecosystem-wide rather than species-wide issues that are out there. We have a number of valuable wildlife refuges, and a lot of our personnel are out there. I was our former budget officer in another life. I'd be glad to follow up with your office and give you some more details on the volume and capacity we have projected into the Hawaiian Islands, as well as what we can do better out there.
Yeah, I think we would both agree that although we can debate over the allocation to Hawaii, and I think 5% is way too low, and so I'd love to spend some time with you on exactly why that is and what your formulas are, and to dig at some of the assumptions under your formulas. For example, you're dealing with ecosystems, and we have a single ecosystem, so we don't cross state lines for a big old, Western ecosystem or anything like that. We have a Hawaiian ecosystem. But I think we would both agree, wouldn't we, that it's one thing to talk about how to slice the pie, but one way to protect our endangered and threatened species is actually have a bigger pie, a bigger effort, a more inclusive effort, and a better funded effort to protect our endangered and threatened species. Would you agree with that? Would it make a difference for us to maximize the funding in this area?
Congressman, if the Congress appropriates additional funding, the Fish and Wildlife Service would mobilize.
Do you think,
that.
sir, that if we increase the funding,
Yes,
that
sir.
it would help?
I do. That would be very helpful for our ability to deliver the mission. And again, we would be glad to connect with you and your staff after the hearing to offer you briefings on what we're doing in the Hawaiian Islands and the capacity we already have prioritized out there.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Before I recognize Ms. Gonzalez-Colon, I'd like to request unanimous consent to enter into the record an article from 2018 responding to a point the ranking member suggested a few minutes ago that California has a per capita mandate on water rationing. The article explains that, in fact, the California law does not mandate anything.
Excuse me,
And
if
we'll-
I may, Mr. Chairman, the law is very explicit. It is enforced at the water district level, but the objective is to reduce residential consumption to 55
The best
gallons
way
a day,
to resolve the
later to
colloquy, Mr.
50
McClintock, and this is
later
my
to 50
time,
gallons.
is to just enter the law and
With
the
that-
analysis of the law
with
so
that
people can read it. The fact check has been done before. It'll be
With that
false.
caveat.
Every time you mention this, it's still going to be false.
Mr.
And so
Chairman.
I'll ask unanimous consent to enter
Mr.
this
Chairman, I'm going to
corrective article in the record.
withhold unanimous consent for a moment until we make it clear that the law specifically references 55 gallons per person per day residential consumption
aspirational goal.
down to 50 gallons per day.
You said it was a mandate and a rationing,
It
and
is
it's
a
not.
mandate at the district level.
It's
And with that
unenforceable.
caveat understood, I will withdraw my objection.
Thank you very much, and I hope we can be more careful about the things we say. So without objection, Ms. Gonzalez-Colon, you'll be recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the opportunity. And thank you, Deputy Director, for being here today. I will begin with what percentage of the ACA listed species has been delisted? If you know the number.
Could you repeat your question?
Yes. What percentage of the Endangered Species Act listed species has been delisted?
So I can provide for you the number of domestic species that are listed right now. There's about 1,662. Right now, in fiscal year 2019, the service has either come out with a not warranted finding or a warranted finding or a delisting for a number of those, and we can provide for the record all of the statistics. But overall, we have tended to move forward and delist anywhere from 8 to 10 to 15 or so far a year over time historically. And I can get you the exact facts and figures for the record in a chart format.
Thank you. My next question will be, one of the bills that we are seeing today is H.R. 4348, and that bill will reverse the 3 final rules published in August of this year by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service, and significantly will revise regulations implementing the Endangered Species Act. Can you provide us a brief overview on how those rules were developed and what sort of outreach, public outreach or stakeholders was conducted, in how these final rules allow the federal government to implement the Endangered Species Act, and how this revision, taking away those 3 final rulings, may affect that?
Thank you for your question, Congresswoman. The effort to target these revisions began about a year and a half ago. Career employees from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service cooperate and collaborate on a lot of these efforts, since the underlying regulations that implement have not been updated since the late 1980s. This has been an ongoing effort. There were a number of workshops and group meetings, and decision was made to proceed on these 3 areas, the 4D rule and consultations, things like that. After the teams prepared these draft rules, they had to go through the interagency process, including OIRA, OMB, and shop them out to all the other alphabet soup of federal agencies. A proposed rule was put out for public opinion, a very robust public opinion. As you can expect, given the topic, hundreds of thousands of comments came back in. There were a couple of open houses held to solicit feedback as well. Then the services go back and try to address the substantive comments that come in, make it a stronger rule. It's then published in the Federal Register, and that was over the course of the summer, I believe, August 18th or so, and I can clarify that for the record for you as well. And then, in essence, the statute outlines the legal requirements for the agencies. These regulations are how we implement them. They're kind of the operating guidance that steps down the operations for the field stations to implement. In a nutshell, what these revisions do is ensure that delistings are held to the same standard as listings. They allow a reasonable approach to critical habitat designation. It gives us a more tailored approach to get the level of protection right, this idea of the pulling back of the blanket rule and having flexibility to determine the outcome based on the right solution there, and a lot more clarity for the federal land management agencies on consultations.
I want to thank you for that. So this was not a one night before rules implementation. There was a lot of outreach to gain those conclusions.
There are a lot of stations of the cross that have to be run before any federal agency can publish a final rule in the Federal Register, including the brokering that's done by the Office of Information Regulatory Analysis at OMB to reach out to the others, and then the public comment period, which is integral to the transparency of federal government operations, putting the proposed rule out for the public to digest, for the regulated public, advocacy groups, industry, and others, to then come back with a formal comment.
I want to thank you for that, and I do have several questions. I'm going to submit it for the record as well, but I want to commend the work that Fish and Wildlife has been doing in Puerto Rico to our endangered species, the parrot, Puerto Rican parrot, the recovery program. Just 2 of them survived the hurricane from 56. So I urge you to maintain the aviary running. The funds are already being approved by this House and Senate, so with that, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Congresswoman. We received supplemental appropriations from hurricane damages. We're full speed ahead on restoring that, and I had the honor of visiting the aviary there in El Yunque National Forest, and a very impressive place.
All right. Thank you. The chair now recognizes Chairman Grijalva for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Deputy Director, the chairman kind of covered some of the areas in terms of questions that I was going to ask, but I have written twice to the Department of Interior, Department of Commerce, requesting documents related to the development of rules affecting the implementation of the Endangered Species Act that were finalized in August, and both departments failed to provide the documents that were requested, both by Chairman Huffman and myself. In response, we received a statement that everybody was working together in a collaborative way. The concern that Mr. Huffman brought up, Mr. Deputy Director, was the political appointees, and I don't want to categorize them as right-wing, anti-public land industry representatives, because that would be unfair, I think. That the political appointees in your agency have significantly edited rulemaking proposals that were drafted by career experts in the agency, and possibly to the detriment of the species. But at this point, now that those are done, the regulations have been finalized, will your agency commit to submitting to the documents for all the committee, all members of the committee, that I have requested specifically on how those regulations were finalized? And with regard to the bill that Ms. Velasquez has, that I believe you support, that EPA found that 97% of the listed species were likely harmed by 2 other common pesticides within National Wildlife Refuge. We asked again for the draft biological opinions from your agency, but the documents have not come forward. Do you now at this point commit to both getting us the information that was requested earlier in the process, now that the rules are finalized, and providing biological opinions on the specific pesticides that EPA identified? Is there some assurance for the committee that those would be forthcoming?
Thank you for your question, Mr. Chairman. Regrettably, I don't have the authority to make that commitment on behalf of the whole department. I will make my personal commitment to you and the committee leadership that I will go back to the main Interior building and stress your request to them, and I will stress the importance of transparency in a public process for these document requests, and that's about all I can really truthfully say to you, sir.
And thank you for forwarding the request again, but I think it'd be important for the people making these decisions of what this committee can see and not see, which is part of a pattern in the administration, to understand that the suspicion and the lack of support on the part of some of us on this committee is related directly to the fact that we do not get the information, and as such, we can't deliberate and come to our own conclusions. So if indeed there was no political interference in the rulemaking, those documents would show that, and I think that's important for us to have, and you can put that argument to rest, or you can validate the suspicion. Either way, this committee deserves that. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Grijalva. The chair now recognizes Mr. Cox for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member McClintock. Mr. Gurdon, thanks so much for coming here today. And in your testimony, you discussed the success of the Nutria eradication program in Maryland, saying, quote, "The value of the success of this program cannot be overstated." Can you describe the impact on wetlands and watersheds of an unchecked nutria population?
Thank you for your question, Congressman. Nutria are an invasive species. They're a very hardy, prolific breeding species. We have a lot of experience working with our state partners on the Delmarva Peninsula, had a very successful eradication effort there. We were able to trap about 15,000 animals, remove them. They had impacted 150,000 acres of the Chesapeake Bay watershed. We've validated and do yearly checks now to make sure those animals are gone. While there, a lot of marshes and wetlands were destroyed. That had enormous impacts to commercial, recreational fishing, bird watchers, the commercial enterprises going on. These wetlands are valuable for absorption of other things, as well as tidal surge, and we're now seeing the same destruction wrought by these animals in Louisiana and now, unfortunately, in California. So the department is pleased to work with the committee on extending the nutria eradication program into California and other states as well to get ahead of this ecological disaster in the making.
No, thanks very much. We do appreciate the efforts in California, particularly the Central Valley, the Sacramento Delta area. Oh, and what are the most effective methods for eradication?
Unfortunately, humane trapping, sir, to remove them from the landscape. We have to go in, or we have contract trappers can catch them and move them out of there. They were originally introduced for the fur trade and quickly escaped the pens and now have gotten out and causing all this destruction. So we have to go in and trap them out.
And I would imagine, is that kind of a straight line function of you increase the number of trappers, you're going to increase the number of rodents or nutria that are captured? And so is it merely a matter of putting the manpower to it, or are there other things that we could be doing as well?
It's almost like a military operation, sir, to align the trappers, target high-producing colonies, get in after them, have systematic, rigorous revisits. It took years to eradicate them from the Delmarva Peninsula, and now we do a lot of monitoring. I believe we still have a contractor on contract who goes back periodically to check all those areas. As we move into other states with this type of program, it would entail developing a rigorous strategy to identify where they're first colonizing and target the animals, and unfortunately, they have to be trapped out.
Yeah, no, cute they are, but they have to go. And I guess it would be very helpful when you say the value can't be overstated to actually put a value on that so we could calculate a rate of return per animal trapped.
We could help, for the record, get you an estimate of the value of lost wetlands to their importance for breeding areas and stopover areas for migratory birds and other waterfowl, other fish species, and other animals. Most animals and fishes and birds in North America utilize wetlands at some form during their lifestyle, and so there's a significant impact if we lose these wetlands and marshes, and so the goal is to get after these cute but ferocious invasive species and get ahead of them.
Oh, absolutely, and the more we can do now to put off these damages later is well supported by this committee and the Congress, so thanks so much.
Yes, Congressman, thank you.
Great, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Well, thank you, Mr. Guertin. That concludes our questions. We thank you for your participation, and I will now ask our expert witness panel to come forward. Ordinarily, I would take the liberty of introducing the panelists at this time, but in the interest of time, I know we've got a 4 o'clock Democratic caucus that we're certainly going to want to be at. So we'll just ask the witnesses to introduce themselves. With one exception, Mr. Case has a guest from Hawaii, and I will give him the special privilege of giving that introduction now.
Thank you for that accommodation, Mr. Chairman. I want to introduce Mr. David Smith here to our left. David is the administrator of the Hawaii State Department of Land and Natural Resources Division of Forestry and Wildlife, or DOFA as we call it in Hawaii. DOFA is actually one of the oldest forestry services in our country. It was started just a few years after we joined the country as a territory in the very early 1900s, because the folks in Hawaii at the time focused on the forest not just for threatened and endangered species, but as a watershed. And they were very passionate about that. DOFA controls 1/4 of all of the land in Hawaii, 1 million acres. David has a very long and illustrious history and career, which I will also, in the interest of time, skip by. But I just want to say that what I hope and expect him to testify to is the value of the Endangered Species Act and other programs, the practical on-the-ground effect of the protection, and what I've already discussed as one of the extinction capitals of the world, an unfortunate description of Hawaii, but nonetheless, progress has been made under federal laws, and I think he'll elucidate that. So thank you for the opportunity to introduce him.
Thank you, Mr. Case. And aloha, Mr. Smith. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Aloha, and thank you for having me here. As Representative Case mentioned, we are unfortunately referred to frequently as one of the endangered species capitals of the world. Hawaii, while having approximately 0.2% of the landmass of the United States, contains about 45 to 50% of the endangered species. So an inordinate amount, more than any other state in the country. We have about 100 plant taxa that have already gone extinct. We have another 200 that have 50 or fewer individuals. It's a pressing concern for our division, who are tasked with trying to protect and manage endangered species. And another unfortunate statistic is that not a single listed Hawaiian species has been taken off the list. And with the idea that every system is perfectly designed to get the results you're already getting, it seems like the funding currently allocated, the only way for a plant to get off the endangered species list in Hawaii is to go extinct, which is not the way that we want to proceed. So the scope and scale of challenges in Hawaii are enormous. There's a huge litany of things threatening species in Hawaii, but the primary overriding issues are invasive species and habitat loss. So between 1990 and 2003, we're having a lot of issues with endangered plant species going extinct. We're losing about one species a year, steady trickle of species blinking out. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service took some discretionary funds and created the Plant Extinction Prevention Program, which was extremely successful in helping us stem the tide. So since that program was established in 2003, we haven't had a single plant species go extinct. Now, that was discretionary funds. Since then, the money has dried up on the federal side, and the state's really been struggling to try to maintain that program in particular. But we do have the baseline, the foundation is set, and we have a lot of good people working on that program. So far, it's sort of a fingers in the dike operation, and we're just trying to hold the line and keep species from actually going extinct. But right now, it's kind of a rearguard action, and not one that is capable of actually recovering species. So we need a little more funding to give us that critical mass. HR 2918, the Title II, would establish the Pacific Islands Plants Conservation Fund. This is critically needed for the work that we do. The focus is to provide effective long-term conservation of plants and their ecosystems. And I think maintaining the ecosystems is a really important piece, to do the overall management for these species. The bill as written contains a full spectrum of management solutions, which is great. It's development and implementation of management plans, on-site monitoring, law enforcement, outreach and education, all very important pieces of the programs that we need in order to work on endangered species. It also establishes competitive financial assistance. The state does really well with competitive. It's also really important because the agencies in Hawaii and organizations work very well together cooperatively. We have a lot of partnerships built up. We have the Watershed Partnership Program, Invasive Species Council, and so there's a lot of entities. It wouldn't just be the state of Hawaii and my agency in particular, but there are a whole bunch of nonprofits and government agencies across the spectrum that are capable of competing for these funds, and I think it would be good to spread it, as we can. It also requires ample match, and the state has been investing heavily in their endangered species programs, and so the state's already well positioned to be able to match federal funds. Hawaii is also the chair of the Pacific Islands Forestry Committee with the Western Forestry Leadership Coalition, so we work with the Pacific Island territories to try to help them build capacity for their programs, as well as just down in Palau last year for the a PIFC meeting, and I think we're making a lot of strides with helping the Pacific Islands in their efforts to protect forests and watersheds and endangered species. As such, Hawaii provides a bridge to the Pacific Islands, and I think we're well positioned to help them take advantage of this funding as well. So Hawaii strongly supports passage of HR 2918, and look forward to continuing to work closely with our federal government agencies on the recovery of Hawaii and the Pacific's endangered plant species. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Ms. Mulhall, welcome. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member McClintock, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me here today to discuss the Paw and Fin Act of 2019 and other important legislation to protect imperiled wildlife. My name is Marjorie Mulhall, and I am the Legislative Director for Lands, Wildlife, and Oceans at Earth Justice, the nation's oldest and largest nonprofit environmental law organization. I'll begin by highlighting the importance and success of the Endangered Species Act, the ESA, which was passed in 1973 with overwhelming bipartisan support. Since its enactment, the ESA has prevented the extinction of 99% of the species under its care. This law is the reason that creatures including gray whales, California condors, Florida manatees, and our nation's symbol, the bald eagle, still exist in the wild. The ESA is our nation's best defense against extinction, and unfortunately this law is needed now more than ever. Earlier this year, a global assessment of the planet's biodiversity found that approximately 1 million plant and animal species are on the verge of extinction due to human-caused threats. In addition to losing a frightening number of species altogether to extinction, we are also losing large numbers of individuals within populations that are not yet extinct. For example, a study published just last week found that bird populations in the United States and Canada have declined by about 30%, or 3 billion birds, just since 1970. I ask you to ponder those numbers for a moment. The abundance of animals, even on our continent, is slipping away by the billions in our lifetimes. In the midst of this biodiversity crisis, we should be working to strengthen, not weaken, our nation's best tool to help protect species. Unfortunately, the Trump administration has taken a major step in the wrong direction by issuing a set of regulatory changes that violate the ESA and undermine the Act's purpose of conserving imperiled species and the ecosystems upon which they depend. Here are a few key ways that these new regulations weaken the ESA and violate congressional intent behind this law. First, the regulations inject economic considerations into species listing decisions. The ESA explicitly requires that decisions to protect or to list species under the Act be made based solely on the best available scientific data. Yet with these new regulations, the agencies that implement the ESA will begin compiling economic information on their decisions to list species. To be clear, this move is a backdoor attempt to undermine the Act and science-based decisions under it. Second, these regulations undermine protections for newly listed threatened species. For more than 40 years, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has extended automatic protections from killing and other forms of harm to species listed both as endangered and threatened under the Act. The Trump administration's new regulations eliminate these automatic protections for threatened species. This change sets up the very likely scenario that birds, mammals, and other species will be listed under the Act as threatened, and no actual protections will be in place to protect them from being harmed or killed. Third, these regulations weaken protections for critical habitat. Under the ESA, the agencies that administer this law are charged with identifying and protecting habitat that's essential for listed species survival and recovery. The new ESA regulations change the definition of what constitutes harm to this critical habitat in a way that will likely undermine protections and lead to piecemeal destruction of this essential habitat for species. All told, the Trump administration's new regulations undermine the strength of the ESA, and they violate congressional intent behind this law. Thankfully, Representatives Grijalva, Huffman, and other leaders in the House and Senate have introduced the Paw and Fin Act of 2019, which would repeal these damaging regulations and preserve congressional intent while protecting the ESA itself. Earth Justice is very glad to support this important bill, as well as other wildlife conservation legislation before the subcommittee today. In this time of alarming biodiversity loss, we need a strong, fully funded, and actively enforced Endangered Species Act more than ever. Earth Justice urges Congress to protect and to adequately fund this vital law. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mulhall. The chair now recognizes for 5 minutes, and I'm going to ask for your help in pronouncing this, but I think it's Ms. DeLatch.
Correct.
Wow, good guess.
Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member McClintock, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to present testimony today on this suite of wildlife conservation legislation. My name is Amy Delac, and I am a senior policy analyst at Defenders of Wildlife, a national nonprofit conservation organization dedicated to the protection of all native plants and animals in their natural communities. We proudly represent more than 1.8 million members and supporters nationwide. Last week, I marked 22 years working at Defenders, and for the past decade, I have focused on climate change and wildlife. In that capacity, I will testify today primarily about the importance of passing the Safeguarding America's Future and the Environment Act, the SAFE Act. I have also indicated Defenders' positions on other bills under consideration today in my written testimony. There is overwhelming global scientific consensus that we are facing a sixth mass extinction, and that climate change is a significant driver of the biodiversity crisis. Last spring, an intergovernmental body representing 130 member countries, including the U.S., delivered a stark and alarming scientific consensus. Biodiversity is, quote, declining faster than at any time in human history, and they warned that climate change is accelerating and exacerbating the effects of other threats like habitat loss and overexploitation. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change delivered a similar message in a report on land use and degradation this summer. Yet another IPCC report on ocean effects is expected tomorrow. The U.S. Fourth National Climate Assessment, a congressionally mandated report released by the Trump administration in 2018, also agreed. Quote, ecosystems and the benefits they provide to society are being altered by climate change, and these impacts are projected to continue. Climate change is not a worry for some distant future or a threat only to species found halfway around the world. Climate change is here, it is happening now, and it is already threatening species across the country. Defenders has profiled dozens of plant and animal species that are already experiencing various impacts. A few examples. Higher temperatures are shrinking Hawaiian honeycreeper's high elevation refuge from deadly mosquito-borne avian malaria. Warmer, shorter winters have enabled a profusion of tree-killing pine beetles across the west and an explosion of tick populations in the east. Loss of snow and ice on land and sea is affecting the polar bear, Pacific walrus, snowshoe hare, and bull trout, among others. Stronger storms and worsening droughts are harming desert, aquatic, coastal, and island species. And warmer, more acidic oceans are disrupting marine food webs, causing seabird and marine mammal die-offs, and threatening coral reefs. To avoid the worst of these impacts to biodiversity, we must both mitigate climate change by reducing our emissions and support natural systems to adapt to current and future effects of warming. The SAFE Act would support climate change adaptation for wildlife habitats and human communities. The bill would reinvigorate and codify the National Fish, Wildlife, and Plants Climate Adaptation Strategy, a roadmap for protecting species and habitats from climate impacts, which was developed and implemented over several years, but like many of the previous administration's climate policies, has been allowed to languish. The act would also return scientific expertise to the forefront of climate adaptation for wildlife and improve the federal government's ability to incentivize and assist state, tribal, and local governments as they prepare for and respond to climate change effects. While helping stem the extinction crisis by protecting species from the impacts of a changing climate, the SAFE Act will also benefit people by ensuring that we continue to have the many services that ecosystems provide. The full suite of legislation being considered today is critical for conserving America's fish and wildlife resources. These bills will return us to a better path for species conservation by rescinding damaging ESA regulations, support conservation and recovery of highly imperiled species at home and abroad, build on existing efforts to conserve wetlands and aquatic habitats, support removal of damaging invasive species from California waterways, and protect wildlife on national wildlife refuges from toxic neonicotinoid pesticides. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on the SAFE Act and these bills, and thank you for the subcommittee's important ongoing work.
Thank you, Ms. Delac. Mr. Seychelles, welcome. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you for the opportunity to testify. My name is Brian Seasholes. I am Executive Director of the Southwestern Communities Coalition, a recently formed organization based in Arizona. The coalition's mission is to promote thriving communities, a strong economy, sustainable growth, sound stewardship and use of natural resources, and protection of property rights. Conservation of endangered, threatened, and at-risk species, which I'll refer to hereafter as endangered species, is a very worthy goal, but it has become increasingly contentious, especially when it involves the Endangered Species Act. So the purpose of my testimony is to take a step back, away from the political fray, and to look at the more fundamental issue of how we as a society can more effectively conserve endangered species. The most important fact to understand is private landowners are the linchpin to endangered species conservation in America because they harbor the most species and habitat. Indeed, 78% of endangered species depend on private land for some or all of their habitat, compared to 50% for federal land. Working landowners, ranchers, farmers, and woodland owners are the most important private landowners because they own almost 1.4 billion acres, or 58% of the U.S. land surface area, live on the land 24/7, 365 days a year, are professional, can-do natural resource managers, and are deeply attached to the land and committed to its conservation. The second set of important facts to understand are the factors that encourage and discourage landowners from conserving endangered species. Fortunately, we have a large body of evidence from scholarly surveys of landowners in 19 states. These surveys reveal landowners prefer a voluntary, non-regulatory, incentive-based approach to endangered species conservation. These same surveys also reveal landowners strongly dislike penalty-based approaches, such as the Endangered Species Act. One such example of this involved an Arizona rancher named Jim Chilton. Due to the temporary presence of an endangered fish on his Forest Service grazing allotment, the Center for Biological Diversity began a process that eventually resulted in the center publishing defamatory material about Mr. Chilton. He sued, won his case, and $600,000, and the jury found that the Center for Biological Diversity promulgated a, quote, malicious lie, unquote. The upshot for conservation is chilling. Landowners become more distrustful and less willing to be involved in endangered species conservation. Landowners' preference for a voluntary, non-regulatory, and incentive-based approach is synonymous with cooperative extension, which has been around for over 100 years. The need to work cooperatively with landowners to conserve endangered species is all the more necessary in the developing world. The calculation for people who live in close proximity to wildlife and are among the poorest people in the world is very simple. If wildlife is not a financial benefit to them, then they may well displace it with forms of land use that are beneficial. If wildlife conservation in the developing world can be financially beneficial to desperately poor people who live in rural areas, such as through regulated, well-managed trophy hunting, then wildlife stands a better chance of surviving. Shifting gears, I will address two bills under consideration. H.R. 4341 proposes to create a fund for endangered species conservation by foreign governments. However, what would be much more beneficial would be to remove regulatory obstacles to commerce in various species that can occur through well-managed and regulated trophy hunting. Or, as the title of a scholarly article put it, quote, banning trophy hunting will exacerbate biodiversity loss, unquote. Nigel Leader-Williams of Cambridge University and one of the world's foremost experts on wildlife conservation co-authored the article. Of the bills under discussion in this hearing, H.R. 2918 has the most potential to harm endangered species. The purpose of H.R. 2918 is to roll back administrative reforms to the Endangered Species Act that make the act more landowner-friendly and lessen anti-conservation regulatory burdens placed on America's most important conservationists, its working landowners. The success of endangered species conservation hinges on whether the concerns of America's and indeed the world's most important conservationists, its working landowners, are heeded. Thank you, and I will take your questions if you have any.
I thank the witnesses, and Mr. Case, I believe you're up first. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Smith, thank you for your testimony. I wanted you to follow up on a comment you made about the plant extinction prevention program. You called it extremely successful. I think those were your words. Just a little bit more on that program. How does it work? Why is it so successful?
The success of the program is due in large part to partnerships that we have, both governmental agencies and private landowners. And we work directly with private landowners through the Watershed Partnership Program. It's a voluntary program where private landowners and government agencies work together on a voluntary basis. And we have MOUs already in place. So we're able to work across a broad spectrum. So it doesn't really matter who owns the land, whether it's public or private. What agency owns it, we already have the agreements in place that allow us to go out and work on the land that has the greatest need. It also allows for some landowners, such as Kamehameha Schools, that has some issues with federal funding. It allows us, if the state is involved, then it helps them with that interface. So it's very, very successful in bringing together landowners to work where it's most important.
Okay, so this is a program under the umbrella of the Endangered Species Act, federal programs, which involves a voluntary understanding between the government and private landowners, and it has been very successful in Hawaii in preventing further erosion. As I recall the statistics, we were losing one species a year before the program, and after that, we have not lost any species, although they are still obviously endangered and threatened, but some of the slide has been reversed.
Yes, sir, that's correct.
Okay, and what is the status of that program right now, especially from a funding perspective?
Well, it's declined by about 75%. The state's been able to, there was a match involved. The state is back down to the state's funding allocation, and so we're operating at about a 25% level at the moment. We've got a lot of good people in place. We're trying to keep it going with some additional discretionary funding, but it's really a struggle, and having another cash infusion into the program from federal agencies would be extremely helpful. All the people are in place, the infrastructure is there, the agreements are there. It's a shovel-ready program. We can stand it up and increase capacity very quickly.
Shovel-ready, proven program, but insufficiently funded and therefore greater risk.
Yes.
Okay. And then turning to the administration's changes to the Endangered Species Act rules. Do you have a view as to what those impacts will mean if fully implemented on the ground in Hawaii? And I'm particularly focused on the proposed weakening of the threatened species category, where essentially they would not continue to have the benefit of the same protections as an endangered classification. Would your view be that under those rule changes, the threatened species would get better, or would they move into the endangered category?
Well, the threatened species changes would remove the protections under endangered. So right now, if you downlist them and don't do a 4D rule, they're still fully protected. If you downlist them and don't do a 4D rule, then they would lose their protections under the endangered species.
And would that place them at greater risk or less risk?
Greater risk, certainly.
Okay, so we would see probably an increase in the number of endangered species if we change that classification or that implementation of that classification.
That's been the trend, yes.
Okay, if not removed from the list altogether by the other alternative you mentioned, which is extinction.
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you very much. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and I now recognize Ranking Member McClintock for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to clarify our previous discussion on the water laws in California, I want to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record California Senate Bill 606 and Assembly Bill 1668, signed into laws, chapters 14 and 15 of the state code, which were the bills I was referring to. Plus an article published at the time from the Coast News Group, which I think very succinctly summarizes the bills direct water agencies to limit customers' indoor water use to an average of 55 gallons per person each day. The goal is reduced to 52.5 gallons by 2025 and 50 gallons by 2030. Outdoor water use goals will also be established. This is what these policies have done.
Mr.
in the
McClintock,
most-
there's no objection. Let's go ahead and get that into the record. We don't need an extended colloquy. If you want to describe them as goals at the district level, that's fine. That's not how you described them
Mr. Chairman, you just
earlier.
lectured us on being very careful of what we say.
And entering that in the record is the
Being very
best
careful
way,
of what we
so we can
say.
actually read them.
Because you don't want to hear what your policies are doing to the people of our state.
Mr. McClintock, each time you misrepresent these as individual mandates on Californians, we will correct you, but let's get it in the
Mr.
record
Chairman, I thought
so
I
people
made it
can read it
quite clear
themselves.
that this directs the water agencies to
It's in the record. We're
enforce
going to move on.
these laws.
We're going to
I'm-
move on.
I'm sure.
This is,
Mr. Chairman.
this is your time now. We
I'd
probably
like to
should have been running
reclaim-
the clock all
I'd
along.
like to
but-
reclaim my time, thank you. Mr. Smith, your testimony, more than 100 plant taxa have already gone extinct and over 200 plant species have 50 or fewer individuals remaining in the wild. 366 of the Hawaiian plant taxa are listed as threatened and endangered by federal and state governments, and an additional 48 species are proposed as endangered. Not a single listed Hawaiian plant species has been taken off the list. Is that your testimony?
I believe that's correct, yes, sir.
Thank you. My a friend from, my colleague from Hawaii calls that a remarkable success. In fact, the Washington Post reported that in the 46-year history of the Endangered Species Act, some 1,900 species have been listed as endangered under that act. Only 47 have been delisted. Mr. Seasholes, would you call that a remarkable success?
Perhaps not.
According to my math, that's a 2.5% success rate. That's what I would call, I mean, I've heard of easy A's before, but that's ridiculous. I think more to the point, it sounds to me like a 97.5% failure rate. Shouldn't we be doing better than that? I mean, with all the money that we've spent, with all of the cost we've imposed on producers and consumers, and all the suffering we've caused by jailing and bankrupting innocent landowners under this law? Shouldn't we be doing better?
I think we can do a lot better. As my testimony stressed, I think the locus of endangered species conservation has to be the landowners. It's the people who are the most important. They are on the ground. And the way I think about this is focus on them and then radiate out. If you work with them cooperatively, if you extend the hand of friendship rather than the fist of regulation, you will get a lot better results. The problem is, a lot of landowners in this country, especially working landowners, are afraid, they're resentful, and they do not like this approach.
No recovered species in Hawaii, 2.5% recovered under the 46-year history of this law. Enormous expense. How can we fashion a law that would actually work in harmony with human nature and produce better results? It's hard to imagine a law that could produce much worse results.
Well, there's another approach to conservation in this country. It's called cooperative extension. It's been around for over 100 years. It's run through the federal government, the U.S. Department of Agriculture and Natural Resource Conservation Service. It's also in every state through land-grant universities. And the idea with cooperative extension is, as its name implies, is to work cooperatively with landowners to implement beneficial conservation practices on the ground. And this is why the U.S. Department of Agriculture's approach to conserving the greater sage grouse, which is an at-risk species that exists across 165 million acres in 11 states, is based on this approach. If you use the heavy hand with folks across the sage grouse range, you will reap very poor results. And that's why the Sage Grouse Initiative's website says, quote, "The Sage Grouse Initiative is a new paradigm for conserving at-risk wildlife in America's western rangelands that works through voluntary cooperation, incentives, and community support." That's a very, very different approach. In fact, it's diametrically opposed to the Endangered Species Act's penalty-based approach.
Well, the penalty-based approach, as I said, is very clearly engendered this response from landowners of shoot, shovel, and shut up. I mean, we joke about it, but that is what they do, and that is the incentives that we've built into the law. That's clearly not working. How do we change shoot, shovel, and shut up to proliferate, protect, and profit?
You make deals with landowners. One, you change your approach. You extend the hand of friendship. And two, if we look to other countries, which I think is oftentimes very useful, like the UK and Europe, the way they treat endangered species is, to paraphrase like the old television show, Let's Make a Deal. They work with landowners and agricultural landowners, and they just say, okay, you have a rare, threatened, endangered species on your land. How can we help you? Maybe we make some payments. Maybe we give you some technical assistance and whatnot, and it's very successful.
Exactly, and I would beg the majority, I mean, we all want the same thing. We don't want to see species go extinct. We want healthy, thriving species. The question is, how do we accomplish it? This isn't left and right. This is policies that work and policies that don't work, and maybe it's time we started trying some policies that work for a change. Yield back.
Amen.
I thank the gentleman. I now recognize Chairman Grijalva for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Seesholz, you're executive director of the Southwest Communities Coalition. I'm sure most folks are not familiar with the coalition yet. So, operating, I think, essentially in Cochise County in Arizona, in those borderlands, which are beautiful. Let me just ask for the record: when was your group formed? Who started it? Just so we can have the genesis of the organization on the record.
It was formed, not quite sure, it was July, I don't know when the date of the Articles of Incorporation, July, August of this year.
And the announcement, the rollout of the announcement was in September, right? The 18th?
It was just last Wednesday, September 18th in Benson, Arizona, yes.
And who started it?
It was a broad-based coalition of landowners, ranchers, local officials. We enjoy the support of 16 counties that are part of the Arizona-New Mexico Coalition of Counties. And if I could just quote from you, at our kickoff event, noted lawyer Lanny Davis was there, and he said, quote, "This is about a bottom-up grassroots movement of people, not financiers of abusive litigation to stop all development. This room," at which we had over 120 people, "this room represents the people. We are the people," unquote.
And who's funding the coalition?
We have a broad source of funding. We have various people. Nonprofits rightfully keep their funding information to themselves for very good reasons. So does the Center for Biological Diversity.
I found it kind of curious that I found that El Dorado Holdings, the developer of the villages at Veneto, had a major role in forming the group. Is that correct? Am I correct in that?
El Dorado Holdings has been part of the process, but our board of directors consists of Jim Chilton, a rancher in Arizona, John Ladd, a rancher in Arizona. We have another gentleman from northern Arizona. We have former mayor of Benson, Arizona. And we have a gentleman, Mike Reinbold, from El Dorado Holdings. So he is one of 5 board members.
Since you quoted Counsel Lenny Davis, and the attorney, and spokesman for El Dorado Holdings, I might add, what role did he play in the formation of this coalition? Because he spoke at the launch event, as you just indicated.
I'm not exactly sure because I was brought on in kind of mid to late July, so.
For a local grassroots, bottom-up nonprofit, this new coalition, getting you to be their CEO, you worked for the Reason Foundation here in DC, the Property and Environmental Research Center, and the Competitive Enterprise Institute, kind of a who's who of not too excited about public lands organizations. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter to the record 2 letters I wrote to BLM and DOI raising major concerns about political interference to undermine the Endangered Species Act and greenlight the Villages of Veneto development project. The department should have completed a biological opinion given the serious concerns raised by Steve Spangle, a former Fish and Wildlife Service official regarding the development's direct and indirect effects on endangered species. However, political staff at the Department of Interior allegedly urged Mr. Spangle to change his opinion. He did so in October 2017, and shortly after, the green light for the villages of Veneto began, and so did contributions to the Trump Victory Fund. I will send those letters for the record. And I have questions for the other witnesses
objection.
and want to thank them for being here today. And let me just Ms. Mulhall, what is important, we've heard earlier in the subcommittee the alarming biodiversity loss we're seeing and the grave consequences it has to people. Explain that link and how Endangered Species Act, if fully implemented, can help promote human well-being. It's always becomes an either-or proposition when it's not. And if you wouldn't mind expanding on that.
Thank you, Congressman. Yeah, the hugely alarming loss of biodiversity has major implications for the ecosystem services that our whole web of life depends on, that contribute literally billions of dollars to our economy every year. As we lose more and more species and individuals within species, we threaten pollination, which is fully accountable for a third of our world's food. We lose important ecosystem services, including nutrient cycling, water quality, so on and so forth. So as these studies on extinction come out and alarm us all, it's not just about our fellow species, it's very much about our own livelihoods and our lives as well.
Climate change.
We are,
okay,
we are at the end. I think that's a fitting final word, if you would, Mr. Chairman. So I want to thank all of the witnesses. Thank you very much. Members are reminded that the Committee Rule 3D, hang on, I have a different final reminder here that I need to read to get us closed out. Members of the committee, for the witnesses, members of the committee may have some additional questions for you folks, and we would ask that you respond to any such additional questions in writing. Under our committee rules 3.0, members will have to submit their written questions within 3 business days of this hearing, and the hearing record will then be held open for 10 business days to allow for your responses. If there's no further business before the committee, we stand adjourned. Thank you.